Okay, if you thought the U.S. China trade conflict was, some dusty old topic about trade deficits from years ago, you really need to listen up, because the latest data we've looked at, especially the recent escalations, it's anything but dull.
It's genuinely shocking, actually. The numbers are pretty stark. For anyone following this closely, the conflict really peaked, effectively, in April 2025. That's when we saw the U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports hit this almost unbelievable level of 145%.
145%.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not just tweaking trade policy. That feels more like an economic wall. And China naturally didn't just sit there. They shot back with 125% tariffs on U.S. stuff. So our mission today is to really dive deep into the sources you've provided and figure out how this whole thing, which started as an economic disagreement back in 2018, spiraled into, this high-stakes cycle that's fundamentally changing global trade, supply chains, everything.
Exactly. And just to ground ourselves, the starting gun really fired in January 2018. That was under the Trump administration. The stated goals from the U.S. side were about forcing changes to what they called China's long-standing unfair trade practices, tackling intellectual property theft, and, of course, that huge U.S. China trade deficit. It was about $375.6 billion in goods alone in 2017.
Right. And China's reaction back then, it was fast, wasn't it?
Oh, immediate. They framed it as nationalist protectionism coming from the U.S., and they promised swift retaliation targeting U.S. agriculture, manufacturing, basically setting the tone for the next, 6-7 years of back and forth.
You really did set that stage. Okay, so let's take that longer view, as you said, back to the roots, maybe the first phase, say 2001 to 2020.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you have China joining the WTO in 2001, getting most favored nation status. That just turbocharged trade growth.
With that explosion in trade came
friction, right?
Structural friction.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of that friction quickly centered on intellectual property, or IP. There was this specific report, March 2018, from the USTR, that's the U.S. Trade Representative's Office.
Right, the main negotiators.
Exactly. And they laid out this charge. They alleged Chinese tech transfer practices were costing the U.S. economy, get this, somewhere between $225 billion and maybe up to $600 billion every year.
Wow. That's a staggering range, but even the low end is massive.
That was the justification.
That was the primary justification, yeah, the catalyst used for the initial crackdown.
Okay, but let's talk about the deficit itself.
Yeah.
Because a lot of economists push back on the political narrative, don't they? They argue it's more macroeconomic.
That's such a crucial point for you, the listener, to really get. It's about savings rates. Look at the average household savings over the last couple of decades. China, consistently saving over 30% of disposable income. The U.S., more like 7%.
30% versus 7%.
Okay.
So the argument is, these trade deficits are fundamentally driven by that difference. The U.S. invests more than it saves domestically. Tariffs, they're just a tax on imports. They can't really fix that underlying imbalance.
Hold on. So if the real issue is, basic economic behavior, saving 30% versus 7%, why the intense focus on tariffs from politicians?
Well, tariffs are quick, they're visible, it's direct political action you can point to. Addressing the savings gap, that means tough, probably unpopular changes to tax policy, fiscal policy, much harder politically. Tariffs seem like an easy fix.
The illusion of a quick fix.
Okay. And speaking of quick fixes, or maybe temporary ones, we got the Phase 1 agreement near the end of that first period, January 2020.
Right, the supposed truce. It touched on IP, tech transfer, but the big piece was Chapter 6. China committed to buying an extra $200 billion worth of U.S. goods and services over 2 years.
The purchase commitments. But how did that actually pan out? Because that's key to understanding why tariffs alone weren't the answer. Yeah, the outcome was, not great for the deal's goals. By the end of 2020, China had only bought about 58% of what they promised for that year. So many economists, places like the Peterson Institute, pretty much called that first phase of the trade war a failure for the U.S., at least based on its own objectives.
A failure. And an expensive one, right? Didn't U.S. taxpayers end up footing a bill?
A huge bill. The sources point to about $30 billion. That's taxpayer money used just to subsidize American farmers between 2018 and 2020, just to cover the losses they faced because of China's retaliatory tariffs.
$30 billion paid by taxpayers to patch up the damage from a policy meant to help American industry. That's quite the outcome.
Okay, that really sets the stage for the next phase, 2021 to 2024. New administration in the U.S., but surprisingly, not a total policy reset.
That's what's so interesting about Section 2. Yeah, a lot of continuity. The Biden administration kept most of the Trump tariffs in place.
Yeah.
And didn't just keep them, they added more. doubled tariffs on solar cells, tripled them on lithium-ion EV batteries in 2024. That pushed the effective tariff on EVs up to 100%. 100% on EVs. Wow. And this continuity, it also led to a major clash with the global trade system, the WTO.
Exactly, the World Trade Organization. In 2022, the WTO panel ruled against those earlier Trump-era steel and aluminum tariffs, said they violated trade rules. But here's the really critical geopolitical moment. The U.S. government basically rejected the ruling, said they wouldn't remove the tariffs.
Okay, so for you listening, when the U.S., a founder of this system, just says, nope, we disagree to a WTO ruling, what does that actually mean for global trade rules?
It fundamentally challenges the whole post-WWII rules-based order. The WTO is supposed to be the umpire. When a major player, especially the U.S., ignores the umpire's call, it sends a message. National security concerns or maybe domestic politics now trump international agreements. It's like saying the rules are fine unless we feel they conflict with our interests.
And it wasn't just the U.S. acting alone in challenging China, right? We saw other major players getting involved.
Yeah, that's right. By 2023, the EU started signaling it was aligning more with the U.S., especially on technology. Their Critical Raw Materials Act moves to block sales of advanced semiconductor chips to China. It showed a strategic alignment forming, not just about tariffs anymore, but about controlling access to high-end tech.
That kind of global pressure campaign needs careful framing, diplomatically speaking. I remember Secretary of State Blinken trying to make a distinction, not decoupling, but de-risking.
Right, de-risking and diversifying. The idea was to signal, look, we still want to trade, we want economic engagement where it makes sense, but we need to reduce our vulnerability, reduce reliance on China for critical things, protect against supply chain shocks or political instability, trying to thread a needle, essentially.
But China didn't buy that framing, did they?
No, not at all. Chinese officials publicly called it just semantics. They said de-risking was just decoupling in disguise. It basically showed that no matter the label, China saw these moves as strategic containment aimed at slowing down its technological rise.
Which leads us straight into the fireworks of 2025.
Yeah.
And those absolutely massive tariff numbers, 145% from the U.S. side. What triggered that specific, huge escalation?
It was framed around national security again, but using a really potent domestic issue, the opioid crisis, fentanyl. In February 2025, President Trump signed an executive order, 14195, declaring a national emergency over drug trafficking, specifically naming fentanyl precursors from China.
Wow. Okay, so using a national emergency declaration that lets them bypass the usual slower trade processes for putting on tariffs.
Exactly. It's a powerful tool. It gives the executive branch much faster, broader authority. So the cycle kicked off again. The U.S. put on 10% tariffs, quickly raised them to 20% by early March.
And China's response this time, did they go beyond just tariffs?
They hit back immediately with 10-15% tariffs on U.S. farm goods, meat, dairy, the usual targets. But significantly, yeah, they also added export controls on some metals like tungsten. And that was a clear signal they were willing to restrict materials, not just tax finished goods.
Okay, then came what some called the Liberation Day escalation in April 25. That's when the math got really crazy.
That's when the concept of tariff stacking became explicit policy. The U.S. imposed a new 34% duty, and the White House specifically said this new duty would be added on top of all the existing tariffs. So boom, the effective rate jumped to 54% overnight on many goods.
Stacking them.
Okay.
And that triggered the final really sharp back and forth.
Absolutely. China matched that 34% across the board on U.S. goods. And in a move that got a lot of headlines, they also suspended the talks about the future of TikTok in the U.S.
Right, and then the numbers just kept climbing.
They did. It got confusing for a bit, but eventually the U.S. clarified the peak effective rate reached 145%. China retaliated, raising their general tariffs on American goods to 125%. It was incredibly rapid, incredibly volatile.
But the really fundamental shift, the thing that maybe changed the game entirely, was China's next move involving critical minerals.
This is the pivot point. April 2025. China didn't just impose tariffs, they suspended exports of a whole range of critical minerals and magnets. We're talking materials absolutely essential for defense, aerospace, semiconductors, EVs, the bedrock of modern high-tech industry.
So yeah, we went from arguing about washing machines and soybeans to basically fighting over the raw ingredients needed for fighter jets and computer chips. This really marks the shift to a mineral trade war, doesn't it?
Precisely.
Yeah.
It confirms it. The objective isn't just collecting duties anymore, it's about asserting control over the foundational elements of economic and military power.
Okay, let's try to tally the costs in our next section. Section 4. What were the real-world consequences of all this, globally and domestically?
Well, on a global scale, even before that 145% peak, the conflict was already projected to shave about 0.2% off global merchandise trade volume. Which sounds small, but it's significant. But maybe more importantly, it dramatically accelerated that trend we talked about, companies moving supply chains out of China, diversifying to places like Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Mexico.
And what about inside the U.S.? For consumers, for manufacturers? Who actually paid for those tariffs? The promise back in 2018 was that China would pay.
Yeah, that promise. It just didn't hold up in reality. The data from the sources is pretty clear. Overwhelmingly, American businesses and consumers bore the cost. We saw prices for intermediate goods, the parts and materials manufacturers use, jump by 10%, 20%, sometimes 30%, roughly matching the tariff levels. Tariffs function as taxes, and typically the importer pays.
So despite all the disruption, all the political capital spent, did the core goal of bringing back U.S. manufacturing actually happen?
No, quite the reverse, according to the analysis. Not only did that objective not materialize, but the tariffs are estimated to have caused a net loss of around 245,000 U.S. jobs between 2018 and 2021.
Wait, a net loss of 245,000 jobs? That must be hard for people to hear, especially those who supported the tariffs, hoping for a manufacturing revival.
It really underscores the complexity. Tariffs made imported inputs more expensive, which hurt many manufacturers, outweighing any potential gains in protected sectors. It disrupted things more than it stimulated growth, it seems.
How did China manage the hit on their end? Losing the U.S. market, even partially, must have hurt.
They rolled out major domestic stimulus, about 2.3 trillion yuan, which is roughly 324 billion US dollars. Big tax cuts for companies, for households, ramped up infrastructure spending, trying to boost their internal economy to compensate. And, politically, the trade war also fueled nationalism, giving leaders a sort of external scapegoat for any economic slowdown they were experiencing anyway.
Thankfully, things didn't stay at that absolute peak tariff level forever. There was a step back from the brink, right? A truce.
Yes, eventually. May 12, 2025, they reached a truce. The U.S. agreed to bring its tariffs down to a baseline of 30%. China lowered its tariffs on U.S. goods to 10%. And that truce was later extended in August for another 90 days. So clearly a mutual recognition that those peak levels were just too damaging for everyone.
Okay, so looking back at this whole arc, we started with fights over trade balances, IP, farm goods. Then it escalated massively into high-tech, using national security, like fentanyl, as leverage, and ultimately landing on the control of critical minerals. That's quite an evolution.
That evolution really is the core takeaway. It began looking like a standard, if aggressive, trade dispute. But the tools used the U.S. invoking national emergency powers, China weaponizing rare earth exports, they show this is now fundamentally about something bigger. Strategic competition, economic dominance, controlling the future of technology. It's way beyond just trade policy now.
Which leaves a really big question hanging in the air for you, the listener, as you think about all this.
Right. The stated goals: fixing the deficit, helping manufacturing. The tariff policy largely failed on those counts, cost taxpayers billions, and arguably cost jobs. And crucially, the U.S. explicitly rejected the WTO's ruling against its tariffs. So the question is, does this signal the real end of a rules-based economic order between the world's two biggest economies? You now have to think about this conflict not just in dollar terms, but in terms of raw geopolitical power and, very practically, the security of your supply chains for essential minerals. What happens if that truce eventually breaks down? Where will you get the materials you need?